question 3. Why did God allow slavery? We're just hitting all the hard ones tonight. Why is the Mosaic Law imperfect?
Push the boys!
So this is from a worldly perspective. People would look at the law and they'd see, God is condoning slavery at the very least. Even if slavery was different from what it was in, 18th century, 17th century America, it's still slavery. It allows for the oppression of women. It institutes the death penalty for minor offenses, and yet it is called perfect, right? How can Christians defend a God who would condone these things? Well, there's a few different ways that Christians have answered this question across the centuries. We're going to focus on just one of the ways that this is answered, but there is other answers that might be more satisfactory to you. So again, do your own research. So, firstly, the law is not meant to be perfect. I know that may come as a shock, but it's kind of obvious when you look at it. The law includes God making concessions for the people's hearts. It includes Moses going to God and saying hey, these women want to inherit land because all the men in their families have died. Should we include that in the law? And God's like, yeah, we should. If this is God's perfect law, then he wouldn't have taken suggestions from the Israelites, right? When we approach the Mosaic Law, we do so through our modern lenses, right? We think of it in terms of what laws are to us. The Mosaic Law was not, the law was meant to reveal Israel's and by proxy all of humanity's inability to be righteous before God. So the Mosaic Law was not meant to be national judicial legislation. It later was adapted to be that by the Pharisees, by the Sadducees. That's how it was later seen. When it was initially set up, that's not how they saw the law. It was meant to be wisdom literature, giving guidelines on maximum punishments for offenses and societal boundaries to maintain order. That doesn't mean we always, every time we find somebody collecting sticks on the Sabbath, we immediately put them to death. That's not how laws worked in the ancient Near East. In the past, order was more important than justice. So kings would be judged as good or bad leaders based on how order was kept while they were ruling. So in our modern day, we think opposite to this, right? So if order is the ultimate goal of their society, our society, the ultimate goal is justice, right? So order being primary means that justice may be forsaken in order to maintain order. We would rather have it the other way. We'd rather have justice at all costs, even if it means chaos, right? We for example, if the president murdered somebody, and it's obvious, he should be taken out of that position and he should be tried for his crimes, even if that means chaos in the meantime, right? Even if that means that the governmental system is going to be suffering for a little bit. In the ancient Near East, it'd be the opposite way, right? It would be better, for instance, for a prostitute to remain in her profession rather than to escape and to seek honest living because of her societal role. It's better for you to keep order than it is to upset the order, even if it means justice would be done. That's why a lot of people were stuck in their lives, the livelihoods they were in, forever. They had no choice because society wouldn't give them any option to choose otherwise. And as barbaric as we may think that is, that's just simply how the ancient world was.
Yeah, I mean, we see it even now with what's the society that has the Hinduism with the
India?
What is the caste system? That's what I was thinking of.
Yeah.
And you're
The
like
caste
stuck.
system.
I know it's a little bit different than this, but still,
Yeah.
it's that idea of there's structure and you do not get out of that structure. So the way we got to think of the Mosaic Law is more like the book of Proverbs. I know it's kind of hard to transition our minds to think like that, again, because like what he was describing, our culture and our way of life. But when we start looking at it with these terms in mind, it's going to help us further understand it. So it's not instructions on how to exactly behave. It's more of like wisdom. So how to live a righteous life before God, guidelines, and that sort of thing. So it's more of wisdom sayings instead, and we have to understand them and use them, not just go, okay, this is what it says, I'm walking the straight line. It's an active use of these laws.
Right.
So Proverbs 13:4, the soul of the sluggard craves and gets nothing, while the soul of the diligent is richly supplied. This is not saying that lazy people will starve, but simply giving wisdom on how to avoid this and wanting to be diligent. So again, this is the idea of it's not always one for one. It's using this and applying it in our own lives.
Yes.
We also see this in Proverbs 13:22. A good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children, but the sinner's wealth is laid up for the righteous. So this verse is not teaching that if you are unable or choose not to leave an inheritance to your children, that therefore you are not righteous. So again, this is not a staying in this black and white mentality. We have to be able to use it. So again, maybe your children are corrupt, or maybe they have enough and they don't need it, so you're going to give to the ministry. There's other reasons that you wouldn't lay up an inheritance. But given the circumstance that you can leave an inheritance and your children need it, yes, it would be a righteous thing to do. So again, it's this active using. So the verse is teaching one to exercise financial wisdom and not be greedy with your wealth. So, actively working towards making a better life for your children and using your money wisely.
Yes.
That is the overarching theme of this. It's just a way in which we enact it. So
What might even drive the point home even further is that the word inheritance doesn't even necessarily have to mean money. It could mean like an inheritance of righteousness that you've laid up for your children, that like you have exampled to them what it looks like to walk in the wisdom of the Lord. And that's leaving an inheritance, right? And the sinner's wealth is laid up for the righteous. Like they're just, it kind of is more pointing towards money, but even still, that's the point, is that in the same way, the Mosaic Law was meant more to be, here is wisdom guidelines for how to better run a society. It is not meant to be judicial punishments for every situation in crime and things like that. It was not immovable if-then punishments for rather specific crimes. Instead, it was instruction on how to wisely discern the heart of God, like we said. Now again, I mentioned that, we see this taught by Jesus. We see that Jesus taught this way of seeing the law in Matthew. So in Matthew 12:1-8, he says, at the time, Jesus went through the grain fields picking on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry, and they began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. But when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath. Working on the Sabbath is in the Mosaic Law. That's against the rules. You're not supposed to do that. He said to them, have you not read what David did when he was hungry and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for him to eat, nor for those who were with him, but only for the priests. Or have you not read in the law how on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are guiltless? I tell you, something greater than the temple is here. And if you had known what this means, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, you would have not condemned the guiltless. For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Now we can take that to mean Jesus is saying, I'm instituting a new rule because I'm God. I have the authority to change the Torah if I want to. You can't interpret it that way. I think it makes more sense to say that the Torah was never meant to be an immovable, this is how we respond in every situation regardless of what's going on. Jesus is trying to say, actually, if you understood the heart of the law, you would see that circumstances affect how you make a judgment. And otherwise, you are not acting in wisdom. Jesus is reminding the Pharisees of how more ancient Israelites saw the law as principles to live by that justice might be done, not unbreakable judicial rules. In Micah 6:6-7, he says, with what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams and 10,000s of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? Now, that would have been a really good time for Malachi to follow up and say, keep the law, that's all God requires of you, do it to the letter, and God will accept you. But instead, he says, he has told you, oh man, what is good. And what is good, and what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly before your God? Summarizing what the law teaches. Jesus also does the same thing by summarizing the law, saying that the whole law is accomplished in loving the Lord your God with everything you have and loving your neighbor the way that you love yourself. That would be the heart of the law. The law was established to show the heart of God so that you can then live in wisdom before him.
So additionally, the laws of the Old Testament were not meant to be binding for all people in every culture throughout all time. It was God working through a specific people in a specific culture in a specific time to reveal part of the character to the nations around them. this part is going to be important later.
I didn't write it in the
yeah,
slides.
that's okay. I added that in there because it kind of goes with what we're going to explain in a minute. But again, that's why things like tattoos, extremely sinful. No, they were part of that culture in that time, and they had a reason for why God put that in there. But we know that for our time and our culture, it's not necessary. We have a whole video about that if you want to go check it out later. But yes, it was for a specific reason, for a specific time, to reveal part of his character.
Okay, so then now we're going to answer the question. So why does it seemingly allow for immoral things like owning slaves or devaluing women, right? Firstly, God admits that the law is imperfect. Jesus is talking to the Pharisees about the law, and they ask him, if Moses commanded us to give our wives a certificate of divorce and to send her away, why are you saying that we shouldn't do that? And Jesus says, it's because of the hardness of your hearts that Moses allowed you to divorce your wives. It was not this way from the beginning. He's literally saying, the law made concessions for your heart. The law is, if it were just meant to be the ideal way of living that God wanted for all people for all time, he would never have allowed divorce. Jesus is saying that divorce is only allowed because that is the condition of your heart, that you couldn't do it otherwise. You know, and it's the same thing with other areas of the Torah too, right? He allowed for the Israelites to work in the context and the culture that they were in, even through the messed up practices that there were, in order to bring about his goals, right? Because of the hardness of their hearts, they couldn't have had it any other way. You know, so he was willing to condescend his infinitely higher moral standards than ours to what the people were able to receive at that time. Now, of course, the goal was for Jesus to come onto the scene and be like, if you actually knew the heart of God, you wouldn't devalue women. If you knew the heart of God, you wouldn't own slaves. If you knew the heart of God, you wouldn't see your brother as lesser than you. You'd elevate them, at least to the level of yourself. And you'd honor them the way that you honor yourself. The way that you love God is the way that you should be treating them. You know, that's why John says in 1 John, like, you can't love God and yet hate your brother. If you knew the heart of God, it's all about love. You know, that's why God is willing to write into his law, imperfect by his standard, laws, in order to accommodate the hearts of the people. And even that they couldn't keep. That's what's so sad about the whole thing, is even though he condescended to them, they still didn't keep it.
Kind of gone over some of this already. Basically, just saying that their hearts weren't ready. God was willing to compromise. I know we've kind of gone through some of that. The same principles, again, we can extend to women, slaves, and other types of harsh punishment for insignificant crimes like breaking the Sabbath. Secondly, even though we don't know for sure which laws were concession to Israel based on their hardness of hearts, we can at the very least conclude that God did not intend for the Torah to be an ideal moral code since it contained these concessions. So again, this is getting in these topics that are really difficult. These are for us to study. This is more in-house stuff because we're trying to decipher the Old Testament and really dig into this book. This is not so much the witnessing tool. This is the how do we reconcile, how do we understand. So the way of seeing the Old Testament law makes sense of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount teachings of, you have heard it said, but I say to you. He means you have heard the law as the unbreakable decision handed down by God, regardless of the circumstance. But I say to you, if your hearts were aligned with God, you would know the right thing to do, and it wouldn't need the law at all. So essentially what Brenton was saying earlier, that God said, hey, the law is here. If you were truly seeking after the Lord, the law would make sense. It would be clear to you. But because you're so hard-hearted, you've used the law in your own fleshly way, and you've missed it completely. But if you were truly walking with God, the law would be easy. It would make sense, you know?
Yeah.
So anyway, he was basically saying they were given over to it.
I think we've beat this topic to death. So we're going to pass that. We're going to go to the objection.
Okay.
Now the Bible does say the law is perfect. So how are we making the case that this is imperfect, right? We're saying the law isn't perfect, and yet Psalm 19 verse 7 says the law of the Lord is perfect, reviving the soul, and the testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple. Now the word translated there as perfect is also used in Genesis 6:9 to describe Noah as a blameless man. It's the exact same word. Yet none of us would try to say that Noah was therefore perfectly righteous and without sin before God, without any type of moral defect, right? and yet it's the same word. A better translation of this word would be the law of the Lord has integrity and it restores life to the wayward, right? Like that's a better way of seeing this verse interpreted. Plus, it's a psalm. Psalms are not meant to be taken deadly literally, not all the time. Now, of course, if you look at some of the prophecies of the New Testament and if you see Jesus fulfilled in some of these prophecies in the Psalms, that can be a slippery slope. But all this to say, if ancient Israel is seeing the law as wisdom literature, and Jesus comes in and says, you've heard it say, now I say to you, it makes more sense to posit they're probably seeing the law wrong, and Jesus is correcting the way they see the law, not making edits to the law. That makes way more sense to me. Yeah, that's so good, because ultimately that's what the law of the Lord was there to do, was to introduce them to the heart of God, to say, like, in these situations, as they come up, explore what the heart of the Lord is. It's to seek justice, to do righteousness, and to walk humbly. And if you're willing to do those things, you will never make a bad decision. Just as a quick aside, and then we'll keep moving because we need to keep moving. But the Pharisees believed that if everyone in Israel just kept the law perfectly for one day, that would usher in the day of the Lord, or at the very least usher in the Messiah. And so they were so dead set on making sure everyone followed every law meticulously down to the very minute letter, right? If every Jew who, they're all spread throughout the dispersion, of course, but if every Jew who's in Jerusalem or in the country of Israel, if they're able to keep the law, even just for one day, that would usher in the Lord's promises. And so, they're starting to interpret the law like it's judicial wisdom of every punishment is meant to be done like this every time, and that was never the heart of the law.